The archaeological team had been digging through the ruins on Kepler 442b for 6 months. When they found it buried beneath layers of crystallized metal that seemed older than most stars in the galaxy there are, Marcus Webb stood in the excavation chamber, staring at the massive stone tablet covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly because they seemed to shift and move when observed from different angles. "Get the council translators here now," he said into his communicator while his hands trembled slightly from excitement and something else. He couldn't quite name, perhaps fear. The Galactic Council sent their best linguistic experts from 12 different species, and it took them 3 weeks of constant work to decode even the first line of the ancient text. But when they did, the entire chamber fell silent. The message was a warning. The being who had written it called themselves the Elders and claimed to have ruled this galaxy 2 billion years before any current civilization had even crawled from their primordial seas. And the warning they left was terrifyingly simple. Something called the Devourers would wake when 3 specific pulsars aligned in a configuration that only happened once every 20 million years, and when they woke they would consume everything in their path until the galaxy was empty and dead. Translators worked day and night to decode the rest, and what they found made seasoned warriors. Dopale the Elders had tried to fight these Devourers with technology so advanced that current galactic civilization couldn't even comprehend the basic principles behind their simplest tools, and they had failed utterly and completely. The warning was clear. When the alignment began, all sapient life had exactly 1 solar cycle to evacuate the galaxy or face total extinction with no exceptions and no hope of survival. Council called an emergency session within hours of receiving the full translation, and representatives from 300 species gathered in the Great Hall on Centrum Prime with fear written across every face regardless of their biological structure. Ambassador Sarah Chung represented humanity at the council, and she sat quietly in Earth's modest chair near the back while species with thousands of years more galactic experience debated and argued, and ultimately came to the only conclusion that seemed rational. They would evacuate. The plan was ambitious but possible. If every species contributed their resources in ships, and the Council's finest minds calculated they could move approximately 90% of galactic civilization to the Andromeda Galaxy before the Devourers fully awakened, it would mean abandoning trillions of structures and memories and histories, but life would continue, and perhaps in another million years they could return to reclaim what was theirs. When the vote was called, every species raised their agreement symbol except one. Sarah Chun stood slowly, and her voice carried clearly through the translation systems when she spoke. Humanity votes no. The chamber erupted in chaos, with representatives shouting in hundreds of languages while their translators struggled to keep up, and the council chairman had to activate the sonic dampeners to restore order. Ambassador Chen, the chairman said, with barely controlled anger in his mechanical voice, "Perhaps you misunderstood the severity of this situation." "I understood perfectly," Sarah replied while meeting his optical sensors without flinching. "The Elders left a warning to run, and you're all doing exactly what they did 2 billion years ago. They were billions of years more advanced than us." The Thelonian representative hissed through her breathing apparatus. "If they couldn't fight, what makes your infant species think you can?" Sarah took a breath and looked around the chamber at species who had been traveling the stars since before humans discovered fire, and she spoke words that would echo through galactic history. "Maybe that's exactly the problem," she said quietly. "Maybe they were so advanced they forgot how to be desperate and angry and stubborn enough to tell the universe no." "This is madness," the chairman declared. "I will not allow humanity to commit suicide. You don't get to allow or disallow what we do with our own lives." Sarah shot back with steel in her voice. "Humanity has faced extinction before, and every single time someone said it was hopeless and we should just accept it, and every single time We survived because we were too stupid or too stubborn to lie down and die. The debate raged for hours, but humanity's position never wavered, and finally the council chairman called for a new vote to expel humanity from the council until they regained their sanity. The vote passed 300 to 1. Sarah Chun gathered her materials and walked toward the exit, while the other ambassadors watched in what seemed like a mixture of pity and disgust. But before she left, she turned back one final time. "When we win," she said calmly, "and we will win because we always do when the odds are impossible. I hope you'll remember this moment and ask yourselves what else you could have accomplished if you'd been willing to try." The door sealed behind her with a hiss of pressurized air. Within weeks, the great evacuation began as ships from across the galaxy gathered their populations and began the long journey to Andromeda, and every departing vessel sent messages to human colonies warning them to flee before it was too late. But humanity didn't flee. Instead, they gathered their fleets and called home every explorer and colonist and merchants scattered across known space. And when the count was finished, 12 billion humans had chosen to stay and fight an enemy that had destroyed beings who could reshape solar systems with their thoughts. They weren't alone, though, because scattered among the evacuating billions were individuals from other species who looked at humanity's defiance and felt something stir in their genetic memory of what it meant to refuse surrender. A Thelonian captain named Kresh brought her entire crew of 500 and declared that she'd rather die with humans than live as a coward and a Basan coward. And a Valaxian philosopher named Thum convinced 3,000 of his students to remain because some truths are worth dying to prove. By the time the last evacuation ship departed, approximately 15,000 non-humans had chosen to stay alongside humanity, and they were labeled death seekers and fools by their own people. The Earth Defense Council held their first meeting in Geneva with Admiral Kenji Nakamura standing before the assembled military leaders and scientists and saying the words that would define their next 6 months. "We have no idea what we're fighting and no guarantee. We can win, but we're going to prepare like our existence depends on it, because it does, so let's get to work." The galaxy watched from their safe distance in Andromeda as humanity and their small band of allies began to fortify and arm themselves for a war against the impossible. The cosmic alignment had already begun, and reality itself was starting to shimmer at the galaxy's edge, where something old and hungry was beginning to wake. 6 months wasn't much time to prepare for the end of everything, but humanity had always done their best work under pressure and impossible deadlines. Dr. Marcus Webb led a team of 200 scientists from Earth and dozens of other worlds as they scattered across the galaxy, searching every known elder ruin for anything that might help them survive what was coming. The Council had taken most of their advanced scanning equipment when they evacuated, but humans had always been good at improvising and making do with whatever they could find or steal or build from spare parts on a dead world orbiting a red dwarf in the Sagittarius arm. They found the first cache buried 3 kilometers beneath the surface that had been bombarded into glass millions of years ago. The weapons, if that's what they were, didn't look like anything humanity had ever seen before, because they seemed to exist in more dimensions than the 3+ time that normal matter occupied, and they hummed with energy that made measuring instruments scream and fail. "I have no idea how to activate these," Dr. Webb admitted to his team while they stood around the alien artifacts in their environmental suits. But the elders left them here for a reason. A young engineer named Sarah Kimura ran her scanner over one of the devices for the 5th time that day and frowned at the readings. "The energy signature keeps fluctuating," she said slowly while comparing her data to the previous scans. "Almost like it's responding to something, but I can't figure out what. Keep trying." Webb told her, "We've got 4 months left, and I'd rather understand these things before we have to use them." They found more caches on 17 different worlds, and each one contained similar weapons or tools or devices that defied easy classification, and some of them seemed to be incomplete, as if the elders had been building them in a hurry before they evacuated. Meanwhile, in the Sol System, Admiral Kenji Nakamura was turning humanity's home into the most heavily fortified location in the galaxy, using every trick and tactic that humans had learned from thousands of years of warfare. Weapons platforms ringed every planet and moon, while defense stations equipped with railguns and laser arrays and newly developed plasma cannons formed layers of overlapping fields of fire that nothing should be able to penetrate. Problem was that should was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. We're building defenses against an enemy we've never seen, using assumptions based on physics that might not even apply to them, Nakamura said during a strategy meeting with his command staff. For all we know, they could phase through solid matter, or teleport, or exist outside normal space-time. Commander Lisa Torres, who had distinguished herself in the border wars against the Krellin pirates 20 years ago, leaned forward over the holographic display of the Sol System. Then we build redundancies on top of redundancies, she said firmly. If energy weapons don't work, we hit them with kinetic rounds, and if that doesn't work, we ram them with ships loaded with nuclear warheads, and if that doesn't work, we get creative. Creative how? Asked the Thelonian Captain Kresh from her seat at the table. I don't know yet, Torres admitted. But humans have a saying, necessity is the mother of invention, and I'd say we're about as necessary as it gets right now. The Allied fleet grew slowly as every available ship was refitted with the best weapons and shields that could be installed in the limited time available, and engineers worked around the clock in orbital shipyards that glowed like small stars from the heat of constant welding, and construction civilian transports were converted into missile carriers, while luxury yachts became fast attack craft, and even old museum pieces from Earth's early space age were dragged out of storage and given new weapons because every ship might make a difference. But even as they built and prepared, doubt crept in. Like fog through a broken seal, people started leaving. At first, it was just a few hundred who quietly booked passage on the last few transport ships heading for Andromeda. But then it became thousands, and then tens of thousands, as the reality of what they were facing became impossible to ignore. The news feeds showed endless debates between those who called the holdouts brave defenders of galactic civilization and those who called them delusional fools, throwing their lives away for nothing. We're down to 11 billion, Sarah Chen reported during a council meeting on Earth, and the rate of departure is increasing. Let them go, Nakamura said quietly, though his jaw was tight with tension. This has to be a choice, and I won't condemn anyone for choosing to live. The question is whether we're choosing to live or choosing to die fighting, muttered a general from the back of the room. The room fell silent until Chun stood and looked around at the assembled leaders. Thermopylae, she said simply. Everyone turned to look at her with confusion on some faces and understanding on others. The Battle of Thermopylae, she continued. 300 Spartans held a mountain pass against an army of hundreds of thousands, and they all died. But they bought time for Greece to prepare and ultimately win the war. We're not 300, someone pointed out. No, Chen agreed. We're 11 billion, and we're not defending a mountain pass. We're defending an entire galaxy, so maybe the odds are actually better. It was a thin hope, but it was enough to keep most people from leaving. And as the cosmic alignment continued to progress, strange things began happening at the edge of the galaxy. Space itself seemed to ripple and warp, while stars flickered in patterns that violated every known law of physics, and the few automated probes that remained in that region sent back data that made no sense before they went offline one by one. Team finally made a breakthrough in month 4 when Sarah Kimura discovered that the Elder weapons responded to quantum entanglement patterns in organic neural tissue. They're designed to be operated by living beings. she explained excitedly while showing Webb the data. Not computers or artificial intelligence, but actual biological consciousness. Can we use them? Webb asked. I think so, but there's a problem, Kimura said, while pulling up another set of readings. They require massive amounts of power to activate and, I mean stellar-scale power generation. Webb stared at the numbers and felt his stomach drop because what she was suggesting would require them to tap into the sun itself and the engineering. Challenges alone were staggering, but they had 2 months left and humanity had never been afraid of staggering challenges. The construction began immediately with teams working in shifts around the clock to build the array of focusing satellites and power collectors that would channel solar energy into the elder weapons people. Stopped leaving because there was too much work to do and every pair of hands was needed. Whether you were a scientist or a soldier or a child who could carry tools and run messages, the Volaxian philosopher Thum started a series of recorded lectures about hope and defiance that were broadcast across all human colonies, and his words resonated with people who needed something to believe in. We stand at the edge of annihilation, he said in one broadcast while his tentacles moved in gestures that translated as fierce determination. But we stand together, and that makes all the difference because the universe is vast and cold and indifferent. But we are not. With 1 month remaining the first tests of the Elder, weapons were conducted in deep space far from any inhabited worlds, and the results were both encouraging and terrifying. When activated, the weapons didn't destroy targets in any conventional sense, but instead seemed to negate their existence by unwinding the fundamental forces that held matter together until there was simply nothing left, its entropy reversal. Dr. Webb said with awe in his voice, "They're not weapons, they're anti-reality devices." "Can we control them?" Admiral Nakamura asked. "We're learning," Webb replied. "But we won't know for sure until we face the real thing." The real thing was coming. The alignment was almost complete, and at the galaxy's edge something impossibly old was stirring in the darkness between dimensions, while reality screamed and tore itself apart to make room for its return. Humanity watched and waited and prepared, while knowing that in a few short weeks they would either prove that defiance and courage could overcome impossible odds, or they would join the elders in extinction. But either way, they would face it standing and fighting because that was what humans did. When the universe said no, they said no right back. The alignment completed on a Tuesday at 0347 Galactic Standard Time, and the universe tore itself apart at the edge of the outer rim. The automated monitoring stations that humanity had placed throughout the galaxy began screaming warnings as dimensional rifts opened in a pattern that formed a rough circle encompassing nearly a quarter of the galactic edge. What came through defied description, because human language had no words for things that existed outside the normal rules of reality and physics. The Devourers weren't ships or creatures or machines, but something that combined all three concepts and none of them simultaneously, because they seemed to shift between states of existence too quickly for sensors to track. They were massive. Some measured larger than gas giants, while others were small as asteroids. But size didn't seem to matter, because even the smallest ones radiated power signatures that made stars look dim by comparison, and they were hungry. The first inhabited system in their path was Helios 7, which housed a population of 2 million brave or foolish souls who had refused to evacuate despite the warnings. The Vidi housed a population of 2 million brave or foolish souls who had refused to evacuate despite the warnings. The Simers used to evacuate despite the warnings. The Simers the Myris the Vregiumaris the million brave or foolish souls who had refused to evacuate despite the warnings. The defense fleet stationed there consisted of 40 ships, including 3 of humanity's newest carriers, and a Thelonian dreadnought that could crack a moon with its main cannon. They lasted 7 minutes, Commander. Torres watched the battle feed from the Sol System Command Center and felt her blood run cold as the Devourers simply flowed around the defensive formations like water around stones. Weapons fired railguns and missiles and energy beams powerful enough to vaporize cities. And they hit their targets, but the Devourers didn't explode or burn or even slow down. Instead, they absorbed everything that touched them and seemed to grow larger and more solid with each impact, as if the attacks were feeding them instead of harming them. Pull back. She heard Admiral Nakamura order over the fleet command channel, but his voice was tight with the knowledge that it was already too late. The Devourers reached the planet, and what happened next made EXPERIENCED soldiers turn away from their screens. Helios 7 didn't explode or burn, because that would have been merciful and quick, but instead, it seemed to collapse inward on itself, while being pulled apart in all directions at once until the entire planet and its 2 million inhabitants simply ceased to exist. Where a world had been, there was now nothing but empty space that radiated wrongness in a way that made reality itself seem to flinch away from the area. The Devourers moved on toward the next system while growing larger with every light year. They traveled. "Get me Dr. Webb," Nakamura said quietly while staring at the tactical display that showed 17 more Devourers emerging from the rifts at the galactic edge. In his laboratory on Mercury, Dr. Marcus Webb was already analyzing the battle data with his team working frantically around him. "Conventional weapons are useless," he said while highlighting sections of the recording. "Every impact we scored just made them stronger." "What about the elder weapons?" asked Sarah Kimura while running simulations on her computer. "They're our only chance," Webb replied. "But we need more data on how these things actually work." Admiral Nakamura appeared on the view screen with exhaustion and determination warring on his face. "How long until the elder weapon array is operational?" he asked. 2 weeks minimum," Webb said. "We're still figuring out the power distribution network." "You have 1 week," Nakamura replied, "because at their current speed, the Devourers will reach the core systems in 12 days, and I need at least a few days to evacuate civilians." Webb wanted to protest that it was impossible, but he'd learned long ago that impossible was just another word for difficult when you were dealing with humans. "We'll have it ready," he said. Instead, the forward fleet engaged the Devourers at the outer rim systems, buying time with their lives, while the tactical analysts studied every second of battle footage, looking for any weakness or pattern they could exploit. Captain Kresh led her squadron in a daring raid that got them close enough to one of the smaller Devourers to deploy sensor pods directly onto its surface. The readings they got back before the pods were absorbed made no sense, because according to the data, the Devourers weren't just consuming matter and energy, but space-time itself, and growing stronger by feeding on the fundamental structure of reality, their wounds in the universe. Dr. Webb explained during an emergency briefing. "Unlike any wound, they grow and spread if left untreated. So how do we treat them?" Torres demanded. "The elder weapons operate on principles of entropy reversal," Webb said while displaying complex equations on the screen. "They should be able to unwind the Devourers back to their base state, but I won't know for certain until we try." The week that followed was the longest in human history, as every available resource was poured into completing the elder weapon array. While the fleet fought a desperate running battle across a dozen systems, the casualties were staggering, with humanity losing 70% of their forward fleet in the first 5 days. But every ship that died bought minutes for the scientists working on Mercury and the engineers building the weapon arrays. Commander Torres led a suicide run at the Battle of Kepler Prime, where she rammed her heavily damaged carrier directly into one of the Devourers while her crew evacuated in escape pods. The impact didn't destroy the entity, but it slowed it down for nearly an hour while it absorbed and processed the massive amount of matter and that hour allowed 3 colony ships to escape with 200,000 civilian stars, was posthumously promoted to admiral, though she never knew it, because she went down with her ship like captains had done for thousands of years when there was no other choice. The galaxy watched from Andromeda with their long-range telescopes and sensors as humanity and their tiny band of allies fought the most one-sided battle in recorded history. Some called them heroes, while others called them fools. But everyone agreed that whatever else you could say about humans, they knew how to make their deaths count. Dr. Webb worked without sleep for 6 days straight, while his team installed the final components of the Elder weapon array, and Sarah Kimura collapsed twice from exhaustion before finally being forced to take a 4-hour rest period on the 7th day. They activated the array for the first time and channeled power from the sun through the Elder weapons while targeting the nearest Devourer, which was approximately 3 light-years from. Saul the weapon didn't fire a beam or launch a projectile, but instead created a wave of anti-existence that propagated through space at faster-than-light speeds by traveling through dimensions that normal matter couldn't access. When it hit the Devourer, the effect was immediate and spectacular. The entity didn't explode but simply began to unravel from the outside in as the fundamental forces holding it together were reversed and negated until there was nothing left but empty space. The command center erupted in cheers while people hugged and cried and allowed themselves to hope for the first time in months. One down, Admiral Nakamura said quietly while looking at the tactical display that showed 16 more Devourers converging on their position. 16 to go. We can do this, Webb said with exhausted confidence. We actually have a chance. But the Devourers were learning the next shots from the Elder weapon array hit their targets, but the effect was diminished because the entities had somehow adapted their structure to resist the entropy reversal, and while they were damaged, they weren't destroyed. They're evolving, Kimura said with horror in her voice while analyzing the data. They're changing faster than we can adjust. The Devourers accelerated their approach towards Sol, and Admiral Nakamura realized with terrible clarity that they had perhaps 3 days before the entities reached Earth. Evacuate the planet, he ordered. Everyone who can get on a ship needs to leave now. What about the array? Webb asked. You stay and keep firing, Nakamura said grimly. Buy us time to get as many people out as possible. The greatest evacuation in human history began. While the Devourers closed in from all sides and the Elder weapon array fired continuously at targets that were learning to resist with every passing hour. Humanity had won a battle, but the war was far from over, and the true test was still to come. The Devourers reached the outer edge of the Sol system on the morning of the 3rd day, and every defense humanity had built over the past 6 months activated simultaneously in the largest coordinated military operation in the species' history. Weapons platforms that ringed Neptune and Uranus opened fire with railguns that launched projectiles at relativistic speeds, while laser arrays powerful enough to cut asteroids in half-painted targeting beams across the void. The Devourers absorbed it all. Admiral Nakamura stood in the command center watching 16 reality wounds flowing through his defensive lines like they weren't even there while casualty reports scrolled past faster than he could read them. Saturn defense grid is gone, reported a tactical officer with a trembling voice. All stations destroyed or consumed. Jupiter fleet is engaging, called another officer. Admiral Chun reports heavy losses, but they're holding position. Sarah Chun, no relation to Ambassador. Chun commanded the Jupiter defense fleet from her flagship, and she was buying every second she could with the lives of her crews. Ships didn't try to destroy the Devourers anymore because that was impossible, but instead focused on harassment and delay by deploying massive debris fields and detonating nuclear warheads in patterns designed to force the entities to go around instead of through it. Worked for approximately 40 minutes before the Devourers adapted again and began phasing through solid matter while pulling it into themselves and converting it to more of whatever nightmarish substance. They were made from all ships fall back to Mars. Chen ordered while her flagship shuddered from impacts that her shields couldn't fully deflect. Fighting retreat pattern Delta 7. On Mercury, Dr. Webb and his team were working frantically to modify the Elder weapon array because the current configuration wasn't powerful enough to overcome the Devourer's adaptation. "We need more power," he said for the 10th time, while Sarah Kimura ran calculations on her terminal with fingers that moved so fast they blurred. "We're already drawing maximum safe output from the sun," she replied. "If we pull more, we risk destabilizing the fusion reactions." Webb looked at her with exhausted eyes that held a terrible understanding. "Define safe," he said quietly. Kimura stopped typing and met his gaze while the implications of what he was suggesting sank in. "You want to deliberately destabilize Sol," she said slowly. "Not deliberately," Webb corrected. "We're going to use a controlled stellar collapse to generate a power surge massive enough to charge the Elder weapons to full capacity. That will destroy the solar system." Kimura whispered. "I know," Webb said, "but it's the only way to generate enough power to stop them. And if we don't stop them here, they'll consume the entire galaxy." The command decision fell to Admiral Nakamura, who listened to Webb's proposal. With a face carved from stone, while outside his window, the battle for Mars was beginning. "How long do we have?" he asked. "The evacuation ships need at least 6 more hours to get everyone off Earth," his operations officer reported, "and another 4 hours to reach minimum safe distance." "We don't have 10 hours, Webb said while displaying a tactical projection. "The Devourers will reach Earth in 7 hours maximum." Nakamura closed his eyes and made the hardest decision any human commander had ever faced. "Begin the stellar collapse protocol," he ordered, "and get those evacuation ships moving faster." Order went out across all channels in the clear because there was no point in hiding it anymore, and every human in the Sol system suddenly understood that their home was going to die. The evacuation became chaos as billions of people scrambled for transport ships, while military vessels that should have been fighting instead broke formation to help load civilians. Commander Lisa Torres's younger sister Maria led the ground evacuation at Snow Polo Spaceport, and she watched millions of people surging toward the launch platforms with desperation in their eyes. "We're not going to get everyone," her assistant said, with tears streaming down his face. "Then we save everyone we can," Maria replied while directing traffic controllers to maximize throughput, even if it meant overloading ships beyond their safe capacity limits in orbit above Earth. The massive colony ships that had been built to house humanity's expansion into the stars were instead being filled with refugees who brought nothing but the clothes on their backs and photographs of homes they would never see again. Captain Crash's daughter, who had stayed behind when her mother went to war, helped organize the boarding queues at Luna Station while sending messages to her parent, describing the chaos and fear and determination she saw in every human face. "They're scared, but they're not panicking," she reported. "They know what's at stake, and they're helping each other even though they know many won't make it." The battle for Mars was brutal and short as the Devourers overwhelmed the defense fleet in less than an hour despite every tactic and trick humanity had learned over 6 months of warfare. Admiral Chun's flagship was the last ship standing, and she gave the order her crew had been dreading. "Ram them," she said calmly. "Full power to engines and aim for the largest one." Her crew didn't hesitate because they'd all volunteered for this, knowing it was likely a one-way mission. The flagship accelerated to maximum velocity and struck the Devourer with enough force to crack a continent, but the entity simply absorbed the impact and the ship and the 900 souls aboard. But it bought 3 minutes for the evacuation fleet, and sometimes 3 minutes was all the difference between life and death on Mercury. The modifications to the Elder weapon array were nearly complete, while Dr. Webb prepared to activate the Stellar Collapse Protocol from his terminal. "I'm staying," he told his team, "but the rest of you need to evacuate now." "We're staying too," Sarah Kimura said while the other scientists nodded in agreement. "You'll need help monitoring the array during the collapse sequence." Webb wanted to argue, but he knew they were right, and besides, there wasn't time. Admiral Nakamura ordered the final defense line to form between Earth and the approaching Devourers, while the last evacuation ships struggled to lift off from a planet that had been humanity's home for 200,000 years. The Valaxian philosopher Thum broadcast one final message from his shelter in Tokyo, where he had refused to evacuate because he said someone needed to witness and record what happened. "We stand at the end of everything we have known," he said while the ground shook from weapons fire in orbit above. "But we stand together, and that matters because the universe will remember that when faced with extinction, we did not beg for mercy or accept defeat, but instead chose to fight with everything we had." His broadcast was cut short when a piece of debris from the orbital battle crashed through his building on Mercury. Dr. Webb entered the final commands that would begin the controlled collapse of Sol, and he took a moment to look at Earth through the observatory window one last time. Planet was beautiful, even now with its blue oceans and white clouds and the lights of cities that had stood for thousands of years. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the home he would never see again. Then he activated the protocol. Sol convulsed as precisely calibrated disruptions were introduced into its fusion core, and the star began to collapse in a controlled but catastrophic chain reaction that would take approximately 4 hours to reach critical mass. The Elder weapon array began to charge with power that made reality itself scream in protest. The Devourers sensed what was happening, and they accelerated their approach as if they understood on some level that this was their only chance to stop the array before it fired. The remaining defense fleet, barely 300 ships from the thousands that had started the battle, threw themselves at the entities in desperate attacks that bought seconds instead of minutes. Every second counted. The evacuation fleet cleared Earth's orbit with 97% of the population aboard, which meant 300 million people were still on the surface when Admiral Nakamura gave the order to break orbit. "Get them to safety," he told the fleet commanders while his own ship turned to face the Devourers one last time. "That's an order." The colony ships activated their FTL drives and began the jump to the predetermined rally point 3 light-years away. While behind them the sun grew brighter and hotter as it began its death throes on the surface of Earth. 300 million people looked up at the sky and knew they were watching the last sunset humanity would ever see from their cradle world. Some prayed, while others simply held their loved ones close and waited for the end. Dr. Webb watched the power levels climb on his instruments while Mercury's surface began to crack from the heat radiating from the dying star. 90% charge, Sarah Kimura reported. 95%. The Devourers were so close now that their reality-distorting presence was causing instruments to fail across Mercury's research station. 100%, Kimura shouted. "Firing in 3, 2, 1. Webb activated the Elder weapon array for the final time and channeled the full power of a collapsing star through weapons designed by beings who had died 2 billion years ago. The wave that erupted from the array wasn't visible to the naked eye, but every sensor in the system registered it as it expanded outward at speeds that made light seem slow and reality itself screamed. The wave of anti-existence expanded from Mercury at impossible speeds, while reality buckled and warped around its edges. Like fabric pulled too tight, Don Marcus Webb watched from his station as the instruments measured power levels that shouldn't exist in normal space, while Sarah Kimura maintained the focusing arrays with hands that had gone numb from the vibrations shaking the entire facility. Wave hit the nearest Devourer, and for a moment nothing seemed to happen. Then the entity began to unravel. It didn't explode or collapse. but instead simply ceased to exist as the fundamental forces that held its impossible structure together were reversed and negated at the quantum level. The effect cascaded backward through dimensions that human science had no names for, while the devourer was unwound from reality. Like a thread being pulled from a tapestry. It's working. Kimura shouted over the alarms that were screaming throughout the facility as Mercury's surface began to break apart from the stellar forces being channeled through the weapon array. The wave continued to expand and struck the second devourer, and then the third, while each entity was systematically erased from existence. But there were 16 of them, and the wave was losing coherence as it spread across the vast distances of space. On the bridge of his flagship, Admiral Nakamura watched the tactical display with desperate hope, while his own ship shuddered from impacts that were getting through the shields. "Status report," he demanded. "8 devourers neutralized." The tactical officer replied, 9. 10. "The wave is degrading, sir." Nakamura's stomach dropped because if the wave couldn't reach all 16, then the survivors would continue their assault, and everything they'd sacrificed would be for nothing. On Mercury, Dr. Webb saw the same problem on his instruments, and he made a decision that would haunt the dreams of survivors for generations. "Accelerate the stellar collapse," he ordered. "That will cause Sol to go supernova ahead of schedule." Kimura protested. "The evacuation fleet won't be far enough away. If we don't stop all of them, the evacuation fleet won't matter," Webb replied while entering the override codes. "Do it." The modifications to Sol's fusion core went beyond controlled collapse into catastrophic failure as the star began to tear itself apart with forces that rivaled the Big Bang on a localized scale. The Elder Weapon Array drank in the massive surge of power, and the degrading wave suddenly stabilized and then amplified as it roared across the solar system with renewed strength. Devourers 11 and 12 ceased to exist. 13 and 14 followed. The evacuation fleet was 3 light years away when their sensors detected the change in Sol's energy output, and the captains immediately ordered maximum acceleration away from the system. "Estimate 20 minutes until the Nova reaches us," reported the science officer aboard the lead colony ship. "We need at least 30 to reach safe distance." The captain, a merchant marine who had been pressed into service when the war began, looked at the terrified refugees packed into every available space of his ship, and he knew what he had to do. Divert all power from life support to engines. He ordered, "We'll suffocate before the radiation gets us if we don't get more speed." "Sir, that will kill everyone aboard in less than an hour. And staying here will kill everyone in 20 minutes, the captain interrupted. "Make it happen." Across the evacuation fleet, similar decisions were being made as captains pushed their ships beyond safe limits, while knowing that some wouldn't make it on Earth. 300 million people felt the ground shake as tidal forces from the collapsing star began to affect the planet's core. Some ran for shelters that wouldn't save them, while others simply sat outside and watched the sky turn colors that had no names as reality broke down around their doomed world. The Valaxian philosopher Thum had survived the debris impact, and he climbed out of the rubble to transmit one final message to the galaxy. "We chose this," he said while blood ran down his face from a cut above his eye. "We chose to stand and fight when wisdom said to run, and we chose to sacrifice our home so that others might have homes, and maybe that makes us fools, but I think it makes us something more. It makes us the kind of beings the universe needs when darkness comes." His transmission ended when Earth crust began to crack apart on Mercury. The facility was coming apart while Dr. Webb and his team struggled to maintain the array long enough to eliminate the final 2 devourers. Power readings had gone beyond catastrophic into realms that instruments could no longer measure accurately. 15 down, Kimura reported while sparks flew from exploding equipment around her. 1 more. The wave struck the 16th. Devourer, and reality itself seemed to pause while the entity fought against its own erasure. For a terrible moment, It seemed like it might resist, but then the accumulated power of a dying star overwhelmed its defenses, and it began to unravel like all the others. All targets neutralized. Kimura shouted with tears of exhaustion and relief running down her face. "We did it, Webb, we actually." Her words were cut off as Mercury's surface shattered, and the entire planet began to fall into the collapsing star DR. Marcus Webb had just enough time to activate the final protocol he'd programmed weeks ago. A data burst containing all their research and findings transmitted toward the evacuation fleet at FTL speeds. Ben Sol went supernova, the star that had nurtured humanity for its entire existence died in an explosion that briefly outshone the galactic core while sending waves of radiation and stellar material racing outward at a significant fraction of light speed. Earth was vaporized in microseconds, along with the 300 million souls who had remained behind. Mars followed seconds later, along with the asteroid belt and Jupiter and every moon and station and piece of humanity's careful construction throughout the inner and middle system. The outer planets lasted longer, nearly a full minute before they too were consumed by the expanding shell of superheated plasma and exotic particles. In the space of 4 minutes, humanity's cradle was transformed from a vibrant solar system into an expanding cloud of debris and radiation. The evacuation fleet felt the shockwave hit their shields, and ships that were already stressed beyond their design limits began to fail. 3 colony ships lost containment, and their atmospheres vented into space, while emergency bulkheads sealed automatically and trapped thousands in sections that would run out of air before rescue could arrive. A transport carrying 200,000 refugees from Asia had its engines fail completely and began to drift helplessly, while the radiation wave overtook it, but most of the fleet survived. The captains, who had pushed their ships past every safety limit, managed to reach minimum safe distance with seconds to spare, and as they looked back at what remained of Sol, they saw nothing but an expanding sphere of destruction. 11 billion humans had bet everything on a desperate plan, and 85% of them had survived to witness its success. The galaxy watched from Andromeda with instruments that could barely process what they were seeing. The Devourers were gone, all 16 of them erased from existence by a weapon the Elders had left behind, and the courage of beings who refused to accept the universe's verdict that they should die for a week. The evacuation fleet drifted through deep space while damage control teams worked to repair ships, and refugees tried to process the magnitude of what had happened. Then, the Galactic Council sent a message. They were coming back. The return took 3 months. And when the Council ships finally entered what had been human space, they found the refugee fleet scattered across a dozen systems, while engineers worked to establish temporary habitats on planets that had never known human footsteps. Ambassador Sarah Chun, who had survived on one of the evacuation ships, met the Council delegation aboard their flagship with exhaustion and quiet pride in every line of her body. The galaxy owes humanity a debt that can never be repaid, the Council chairman said with something like awe in his mechanical voice. "You saved us all." "We saved ourselves," Chun corrected. "You just happened to benefit." The Council offered everything: entire star systems and resources, and a permanent seat on the ruling council with full voting rights. Chun listened to it all and then made her request. "We want access to the Elder Archives," she said. "All of them." The chairman hesitated because the archives contained knowledge that most species weren't considered ready to handle. "That's highly irregular. You owe us a debt that can never be repaid," Chen interrupted while using his own words. "And that's what we're asking for." The Council granted the request. Dr. Webb's final transmission was recovered from the lead colony ship's databanks, and it contained not just the technical specifications for the Elder weapons, but also something he'd found in the deepest levels of the archives on Kepler 442b. A second message from the Elders. This one had been hidden beneath layers of encryption and warnings that said it should only be opened by those who had proven themselves worthy through Sacrifice. When Chun read it, she understood why the elders had fled. The message wasn't a warning to run from the devourers, but a warning that stopping them would require a sacrifice so terrible that most civilizations would choose extinction over paying the price. The elders had faced the same choice 2 billion years ago, and they had chosen to run because they weren't willing to destroy their own civilization to save it, but humanity had been willing.